Welcome to Radio Survivor. We're here for the love of radio and sound. I'm Paul Riesmandel.
Hello, everybody. I'm Eric Klein.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Waits.
Today, we're going to talk about the next opportunity to put a non-commercial, brand new radio station on the air in the United States. We know that's something people get very excited for. And then we're also going to talk about cassettes for art, for radio, for sound. Are they back? Did they go away? What are we doing with them? And we're going to get a rundown on some recent radio scholarship and podcast and sound scholarship with Jennifer, and discover, well, why is this important, and why do we talk about this stuff? So that's all coming on today's Radio Survivor. We hope it'll be fun for you. It'll certainly be fun for us. But first up, there is an opportunity, and we've discussed it a couple times in the show, but now there are dates. There are dates, definitive dates in the calendar when nonprofit organizations, it could be a local club, a local organization, a school, a high school, a college, university, or a church, a religious group, has the opportunity to apply for a new non-commercial radio station here in the United States. And it's a so-called NCE license, which stands for non-commercial educational, because that's supposed to be what it's for, education. And it's a full power license. This means the licenses are going to be a minimum of 250 watts and up, but in many cases, much bigger, kilowatts of power. And what that means is that the stations, in many cases, can cover a fair amount of territory. We've often talked about low power FM, which is a specific type of non-commercial license where the maximum power is 100 watts. They're meant to cover small areas, towns, neighborhoods, small cities, and are very inexpensive to put on the air. This is not that. We're talking about, think about the NPR affiliate in your town, or a high-power college radio station or community radio station. That's the type of license that we're talking about in this case. And so that opportunity is coming up November 2nd through 9th. The FCC now runs what's called a window, which means it is simply a time when you can go ahead and apply for one of these licenses. A fair amount of work is involved. These are not super simple licenses to get, so this is something where you definitely want to consult an engineer or a broadcast lawyer or both to help you along. And I know that there are several nonprofits, such as Common Frequency, are going to be there to try and help community groups, especially focused on community radio, direct them and help them get the assistance they may need to put one of these stations on the air. But, it's coming up November 2nd through 9th, and so the time to get organized is now and to begin doing some of that work. We don't yet know or have a strong sense of what cities and communities are likely to be included. That information should be forthcoming pretty soon. And also, like, how large of a station in these cities and communities. We can probably say most large metroplexes are probably not going to be included. Or at least if there is a station included, it's going to be kind of what we call a rim shot signal. So something that's in like a far suburb or far exurb, maybe a sister city in some cases, but in places like, say, Chicago, San Francisco, Los Angeles, New York, it's unlikely there'll be too many frequency opportunities, except in the case of probably if there are any stations that have essentially gone off the air and turned in their licenses. Typically these days on the FM band, stations sell their licenses, even if they're going off the air, and transfer them. So there's very few cases of them being turned back into the FCC, but that's plausible. So really the opportunity is probably going to be in smaller cities and towns and rural areas, but these are all places that need great radio. So we just want to make sure everyone knows about that. I don't know if I'm leaving anything out, Eric or Jennifer.
Yeah, well, I just want to let listeners know that we've talked about this topic recently in more detail, and they can check the show notes to if you want to hear more of Radio Survivor's advice on what we think about this opportunity for new community radio stations to go on the air.
We got advice from a broadcast lawyer, so somebody who has experience working with the FCC and applying for licenses with the FCC. So it's very good advice. Go to radiosurvivor.com for those show notes. Now for the even more fun stuff, Eric. You recently took a workshop using cassettes for art.
Yeah,
Tell us about that.
It was the highlight of my pandemic, friends. Other than the Radio Survivor podcast, I signed up for a workshop with an organization known as Dogbotic, which they call themselves a Berkeley-based audio laboratory that makes strange and lovely sounds for strange and lovely people. At least that's how they addressed an email to me after I signed up. It was only one weekend for me, but it was a 20-hour span of time. And there's so much I can talk about with this workshop. It was called cassette hacking. Dogbotic teaches numerous workshops, all in the realm of sound and technology, I think is a good tent to put over the work that they do. They let us know that at the beginning of the workshop that in the before times, they were more of a collective of artists that would create both professional work for hire, scoring advertisements on the internet. I've noticed that some of the work they were doing, like getting a custom score and soundtrack for your Instagram campaign, but also doing artwork in public spaces like galleries. But during the pandemic, they were teaching these workshops over Zoom. And the workshop that I took was cassette hacking. My goal was to learn how to open up a Walkman, an off-brand Walkman, not an original Sony Walkman from the 1980s or 90s, but a brand new Walkman. And Paul, maybe you might even know more about that Walkman than I do, the particular device. But opening up this device that plays cassettes and learning how to get into the guts to circuit bend and control both the motor to change the pitch of what's coming out of the tape, as well as we learned how to control the amplitude of what's coming out of the tape. So and then linking that control to different kinds of electronic circuits that give you numerous opportunities to twist knobs and press buttons to change the outcome. So that was the physical goal of the workshop, cassette hacking, that Dogbotic taught. There was about 50 people that took the class live on Zoom over the weekend, and but there was a larger concept at work that the instructors were sort of had in their hearts, in their minds, of teaching people. They had a vision for these classes beyond just opening up the cassette deck. They wanted to make sure both to demystify the process of electronic engineering. There was a discussion early on in the workshop that a lot of people who have this skill set can be gatekeepery or rude when they're faced with beginners, or just downright unwilling to help. And this workshop, they wanted to foster a completely different sense of teaching new skills to people. There was also a little bit of that fetishization that we love so much here on Radio Survivor of the physical media. It's worth mentioning that I was one of the elders in the class at age 44. A lot of people in their 20s. There was even some teenagers taking the class.
So yeah, maybe I want to bring the question: why would somebody want to take a class to learn how to take apart a cassette Walkman to vary the speed and play with the amplitude and other aspects of the sound? Especially, why would somebody who's 18 years old want to do this? What's the allure here? What's kind of applications for this hacked Walkman?
Yeah, well,
and can I add to that? And does that mean that these 18-year-olds have an experience with Walkmans already?
So interesting, wonderful question. And part of me as a radio producer wanted to get an answer from each individual from the class. Everybody who took the class, all 40, because it was maybe 43 people taking the class, and then about 7 or 8 instructors who were floating around helping, and also fascinating individuals with their own experiences with physical media and cassette tapes. So I'm going to be generalizing, but they all did. Everyone did answer that question of what is their experience with magnetic tape in these beautiful little plastic boxes that we call cassettes. So your question was, what is their experience with? Do all of them have experience with it? No, the organization Dogbotic that ran the cassette hacking workshop sent each individual participant a package in the mail that included a handful of cassettes, some blank, one a short 10-second loop, which is pretty impressive, a handmade loop, cassette loop, as well as one commercially produced cassette. So mine was from 1995 and was a Christian walking workout cassette tape that had
That's
a
amazing.
certain beats per minute. The workout begins at 110 beats per minute and accelerates to 134 beats per minute, and then goes back down to 110 beats per minute cool down session. And there's a cue in the middle to flip the tape over if you want half a workout. So many of the participants did not have experience with cassette tapes in their lives, and many did. And what can they do? The majority of people taking the class were musicians or composers or musically minded individuals. There was a handful of people I would more term fascinated by sound art, even though maybe they didn't necessarily even know that that's if they were loyal Radio Survivor listeners, they might call themselves sound artists or sound workers. We had interviewed Michelle Hilms a day before I took the class, and so actually the same day that I took the class. And Michelle Hilms was on Radio Survivor evangelizing the term sound work to describe what people do when they create either radio podcasts or internet sounds that's not strictly music. And so I was really surrounded by sound workers, even though they wouldn't all self-identify. And so when you have a hacked cassette deck, it gives you numerous opportunities to create a unique set of sounds that are not otherwise available in the vast world of sound design that currently is part of most people's
But is that true? I mean, because I think one question is that these days computers can do a lot with sound, right? And in computers, I'm going to include smartphones, and I'm going to include tablets. I'm going to include, probably Chromebooks, right? The type of digital devices that, a Zoomer has grown up with as part of their life. The software is there. Many indie rock, independent music releases are made completely on a computer. And you can manipulate sounds 100 different ways, speed them up, slow them down, etc. So what is the appeal of doing it, with, essentially what is 30 to 40-year-old technology that's, to some extent not so available as easily as it once was, compared to doing it just sitting down with a copy of, Pro Tools or something else.
GarageBand. Yeah. Well, for me, my answer is different than everyone else in the class. It would be really interesting to pin down the 18-year-old and be like, but why? But why are you so fascinated by this? I would say that that for me, I think that my answer does overlap with what the other people who took or even the people that were running the class would say, is that the physicality of the choice that you're making to slow down your audio, to speed up your audio, as well as the limitations of this particular technology is the point. I mean, yes, you could do anything in your digital audio workstation known as a DAW. You can do anything with a DAW, but you can't physically touch the sound the way that you can with the cassette tapes. And I mean, literally, some of the artists that were participating, would physically touch the motor to slow it down and then speed it back up again, as well as
like you would do with a record,
yeah,
right? Effectively, which many DJ has done with a record if
right.
they had no other facility to otherwise manipulate the rhythm and tempo.
Right. It's also making me think about effects pedals. That that's another physical tool that you see musicians using.
Right.
I've had a lot of experimental musicians come on my radio show, and often they have just like a whole suitcase full of tools like that they play with. Did you get a sense that there was some of that orientation among some of the musicians, and do you know if they had familiarity with other sorts of tools that they could manipulate with their hands or their feet?
Yeah, most definitely. I think that what we're sort of circling right now is there is actually a wider discussion going on in a community outside of Radio Survivor, which is sort of the musical composer community, and I've tapped into that for the most part via YouTube. Take that with a grain of salt, but there is because you have digital audio workstations that can do anything, that can emulate any synthesizer, that can give you any choice. There is a large community of people, significant, who still are making that choice to use effects pedals that are self-contained, 80s technology, 90s technology, as well as the synthesizers that physically exist, even if they're built in the last 5 years while these digital audio workstations. The
synthesizers using technology basically that was developed in the 60s and 70s.
Sometimes.
It's just a modern, but that is, a modern incarnation of it.
Yes, no, there's a synthesizer I have my eye on that's actually entirely digital, but still, I mean, for one thing, your MacBook Pro is only as good as Apple is. At some point, your no matter how hardy and useful your MacBook Pro, for instance, to name this one brand, it has a sell by date that is built into the corporate culture, and so that's one reason why you might want a physical machine to rely on that's not your computer. You're sort of locked into always buying a new computer as soon as you depend on computers for your
right.
Your
as
work.
Soon as the software goes out of date or no longer works with the kind of hardware you have, or your hardware that you used to work with your old Mac doesn't work with your new one or your new computer and things like that. And those are real choices. I'm kind of reminded. I recently read an interview with John Leidecker, who is a member of Negative Land. He performs under the name Wobbly. And I went down this hole because Negative Land's done a series of live concerts online in the last month or so. Negative Land, we've talked about many times in the show. They're connected to the show on KPFA called Over the Edge, a long-running collage, experimental, culture jamming program that is going on 40 or more years old. And so it's been interesting watching. They even did a Tiny Desk concert, which is an NPR concert series called Tiny Desk because it used to be bands would come in and perform around somebody's literal desk in like a newsroom
in the Washington D.C.
In Washington D.C.
Bob Boilen,
but of course now they're Bob Boilen. But in this case,
we will know that the pandemic has come to an end or significant milestone when the first Tiny Desk concert. Is in 2021, hopefully, is recorded at the NPR offices in DC.
So they were all each spread out into individual homes across the country, the members. I think there were 4 who were participating. And they're all, they do a live collage. So taking cut up sounds and putting them together, which includes, cut up, things from movies, things from television, as well as musical sounds that may be produced with musical instruments or other homemade electronic things, such as something called the booper, which is something which one of the members has been manufacturing himself for many years. It kind of makes it sound like it's onomatopoetic. But I reading this interview with John Lineker, who also performs with other artists, including Thurston Moore from Sonic Youth, talking about the fact that he didn't want to be hiding behind a laptop when he performs, especially on stage, to just be that. And he's actually mostly now works with iPads, which he has several of, but uses software that allows him to manipulate the sound both physically and sonically, like you would expect either a tape being run back and forth across a head or like vinyl.
I wonder what he does
like
when the apps that he's using on his iPads are no longer supported by the operating system. I wonder if he has
just don't update those iPads.
Right, yeah. I wonder if
That's
he's air-gapped the iPads just to maintain their sonic usefulness to his art.
But even thinking about the fact is that, you see electronic musicians and experimental musicians, and sometimes where it is just you're looking at someone behind a laptop. And on the radio, I guess nobody knows that you're behind a laptop. Nobody knows you're not a dog. But if there's any sort of live performance, whether it's, televised, if it's live online or live in person, having all these other physical objects, knobs to twiddle, records to scratch, whatever. I mean, there is nevertheless something much more like watching a conventional musician who uses a guitar, drums,
and that's what I'm going to go out on a limb and say that the majority of people that took this workshop, no matter what their age was, have a lot of experience getting their fingers, toughening up their fingers on physical instruments, even if they were born, after the iPhone was invented. They still know the value of playing a guitar or playing a keyboard, a piano. So another thing that was really exciting about the Dogbotic cassette hacking workshop that I hadn't anticipated was just the nature of coming together with a community of people around a shared goal. It reminded me of my youth in community radio. It's just very, one of the unique things that they did with this workshop. And again, some people who are probably too young to remember a world before Facebook. They actually have the Dogbotic organization has I'm assuming it's like a Drupal website that's entirely that reproduces the connections that social media once promised back before they became billion-dollar corporations. The sort of getting to post a blog entry and then have people comment on your blog entry, and all of that devoted to one small community. This is a kind of internet that a lot of people might remember from the early 2000s. Dogbotic had that. They've built that website specifically for the group of people, both who are taking this one workshop as well as all of their other workshops that they had that they put on. It was a really interesting weekend. It was also there was a new, not only were we cassette hacking, opening up these beautiful cheap Walkmans and finding which points on the circuit board controlled, could be manipulated to control the motor. But there was also a lot of broader discussions opened up. There was some, we actually had the one of the organizers of the entire community, whose name is Kirk Pearson. They sent us. They said, one of the things, how they ended the first long day of work, our secret homework at the end of that day was to take one of the cassettes, fast forward it to the, it was like a kind of a scavenger hunt. I forget the exact coordinates of the hunt, but to find a secret spot on one of the cassettes that they had sent us and listen to what was essentially a little, like, I labeled it a podcast interview, but it was a phone interview between Kirk and their friend sometime during the pandemic. So it really had that all the themes that have come up during this strange year of isolation. Reaching out to a friend, recording this phone conversation to, sharing it with everyone who's taking this class, this community, sharing it via cassette tape. So we all had it was the kind of podcast that I once dreamed of in the year 2000, really like mailing cassettes out to your audience. And their conversation that they had was a wide-ranging philosophical conversation. It was edited down to 12 minutes, but part of it was a discussion of whether or not the streaming music paradigm that is dominant in today's listening culture is bad. Is super bad compared to what was possible beforehand. And so that was a personal conversation between Kirk and their friend on this podcast. Kirk was wondering, are we living in the dark ages of media because we've lost physical contact with our music? And then the next day, that was how we started our Sunday, was a small group conversation of how do we feel about the ideas addressed in Kirk's radio zine that they slipped it right under our earbuds. The instructions were to listen to it before bed. So
let it sit in your head. It's what's interesting to me talking about physical media like cassettes here on Radio Survivor is that on the one hand, this idea of tape manipulation, right? Using the tape not as it was intended. Goes back a long time, pretty much the earliest days of tape being available as a sonic medium, employed in musique concrète, or in the BBC's radiophonic workshops, as well as artists both popular and sort of more sort of high culture artistic intent.
Yeah, my first exposure to the concept was the edited tape work of Yannis Xenakis, who is a Greek composer who's, I think the work that I'm thinking of is from the 1950s. And Yannis Xenakis also had symphonies for orchestra, cellos and violins and whatnot. But Xenakis also went ahead and created an entire composition that was one of my favorite things 25 years ago. That's all manipulated tape from the 1950s. So a very early adopter to the potential sound potential of manipulating tape.
Yeah, and yet, I'm verging on 50. I've been aware of sort of tape art and manipulations for more than half my life.
Right.
And I'm going to go on a limb and say I don't remember a time when this sort of manipulation has actually been this popular.
Right. Yeah, no, that's a really good
point.
And
I'm certain the internet is part of that. The ability to see somebody on YouTube doing it, and sometimes showing you how they did it.
Yeah.
Right? Because otherwise, even if you were sort of listening to the works, you only have access to the sound, and not always as easily to the visual of it in a prior age.
Yeah, I would also add that it's, Paul, you pointed out that the cassette Walkmans that they sent us are available online for purchase for between $13 and $19, which I'm pretty sure is the most affordable that device has ever been in the history of the device.
Especially, right, adjusted for inflation, right?
Yeah.
That's
and
amazing.
They're not good.
No.
The ironic thing about cassette culture, I think, in the 21st century, right? There's press about the cassette revival, like there has been about the vinyl revival, and much of it's, I think, trite. It's either like, look at these hipsters and their cassettes, whoa, or why would anyone want to listen to that old trash? It doesn't seem to be very nuanced, right, about these things. But one of the ironies of it is that, unlike turntables for vinyl, it's hard to get a good cassette deck anymore.
Yeah,
they simply really don't make them. And mostly what you find are versions of something that comes out of probably 1 out of 3 factories somewhere in China or East Asia, and they're that simply aren't very good. You won't find a Sony or a Panasonic.
You're going to have to go to a vintage machine to really get the good stuff.
It's interesting you're talking about the machines, because when back to sort of these early pioneers in tape manipulation, I always thought that had to do with manipulating the tape, not the device. And so what's kind of cool to me about your workshop is that you're manipulating the device. Were you also manipulating the tape as well?
Well, there was a moment in the workshop where they did teach us how to build your own tape loop, which is a beautiful thing that's been, speaking of what Paul just mentioned, how this is 30-year-old technology, and yet the thing I'm going to mention is something I've only known was popular in the last 4 years. And it's, you take the cassette, the small plastic box about the size of a credit card, you unscrew it, you open it up, you take out the reel that's inside, and you create a 10-second long version of it, loop it around, put it back inside the box, close it up, and now instead of 45 minutes tape that only goes one way and then you rewind it, this is a 10-second loop that goes forever. And you can record onto that anything you want to. So that's one
version of this would have been used in answering machines,
right,
if we remember them, beginning in the 70s as your outgoing announcement.
That's right.
Because it would have to loop around and be played again and again and again. Those machines often had 2 tapes. So you could buy these commercially, but they weren't intended for art. They were intended for, something. And usually more like 30 seconds. Plays the one tape. Hi, this is Paul. Can't come to the phone right now. Leave a message. But
a lot of us used our answering machines as artworks.
Yeah.
Right.
Because I remember recording sounds. I had, in the 90s, early 90s, I had a doorbell where you could listen to the sounds outside when somebody came to the door and then push a button to let them in the building. And so I would push record. I lived on a really popular street, and so I would record sometimes street noise and then put that on my answering machine. By holding up my answering machine, I would hit record while I was pushing the button to hear the ambient noise outside. And, a lot of my friends had answering machines, so you would hear weird things.
Oh yeah, and there's a whole industry of amateurly produced professional tapes that you would purchase for your answering machines, specifically mostly comedy tapes.
Right.
What a ludicrous thing that once existed.
Well, Jennifer, you point out the difference between manipulating the medium and manipulating the machine, right? And in part, I think that's because for much of the time that tape has been used as an artistic medium in and of itself, as a musical medium, folks used reel-to-reel machines, right? So in a reel-to-reel with the construction, you have a reel to tape that goes to another reel of tape, and they're big. They're like 7 inches or larger. And the tape heads and all of the mechanism is exposed, right? So the ability to kind of touch the tape and get at it is very easy. It's like, like a film projector in that way. And also the machines are very expensive. And so there's probably an inhibition, unless you were willing to make these investments to actually modify the machines, especially if maybe the machines belong to somebody else.
But then
say
these
you're
machines,
in a radio station or a library or
but
something.
A lot of them also would have a lot more controls that you could manipulate.
Yeah.
That the $13 Walkman recently produced in a factory in China.
Like that. Right.
Yeah. So you would be able to, one of the things that we could not do in the cassette hacking workshop was reverse the tape. With this, this particular motor is not going to go, and the mechanism of the Walkman that we were manipulating was never going to go backwards.
That's too bad.
Yeah.
But all of us who learned how to edit on reel to reel learned how to edit to make something go backwards, which I remember doing that project, and it was super cool.
There is still a way, right? There is still.
Well, I mean,
you
could take apart the tape, cassette
right,
tape, and just reverse the tape, which is effectively what you did on a reel to reel, except it was just as simple as swapping the reels.
Yeah.
And then many tape machines also had the ability to go backwards. But I think, that's why we're arriving at it here, in 2021, because reel-to-reel decks haven't been made for even longer. So, there hasn't been a new one manufactured, and I'm not sure how many were even manufactured in this century. And so they're even rarer. They were rare to begin with, right? And as more people sort of decide they might want to try using one for art or in various purposes, then
because of one popular YouTube channel that
because
won't
the market
that
goes
won't
up
be
and they
mentioned
become harder
right
to
now.
get.
Yeah.
And that's why, but the cassette players, because as long as you're willing to work with one that isn't particularly high fidelity, isn't great necessarily for pleasurable listening, but records sound and plays it back, as long as you're willing to deal with that constraint, and in many cases the constraint I'm understanding is part of the allure, you don't have a lot to lose in disassembling and possibly breaking a $13 cassette player,
right?
Versus disassembling even the $150 new in box Walkman that you found on eBay or somewhere else,
right?
Yeah. And that's, I think it really does. I think this really does relate to radio, not just because of the history, but because, in fact, although a lot of people don't realize, tapes have been critical to radio broadcasting until the digital era really took over, whether it was for recording field audio, on cassettes, because that was the easiest way to go, recording programs off satellite, or just simply recording them
up until the year
future playback.
Up until the late 90s, that would have been, and during the early 2000s, you'd still have, that would be a transitional moment for radio, that, that the reporters would be out in the field with the cassette recorder. The alternative was a mini disc player, and so there'd be a overlap in adoption of new technology at that point.
And also archiving, the way that we archived our radio shows was on cassette.
Right.
And I remember having a dedicated air check cassette deck. There was even one that just recorded our voices, our mic break. And so you could have program directors listen to what they call a scope check. And it was on cassette, and it was all of just the voice parts of your show, so they could critique you.
Well, and
because it would only turn on when the mic went on.
Yeah,
exactly.
And it would only turn on when the mic went on.
One of the stories that I shared with the people in my workshop by way of introduction was that when I was working at KPFA in the early 2000s, one of those shows that had the most the largest workload, the morning show, would interview people, sometimes four people a day. And sometimes they were interviewing world-renowned intellectuals and artists. I think the story in particular that I was told might have been about Maya Angelou. And computers, which are amazing and have crystal clear digital fidelity, if the power goes out or if there's some kind of software or hardware issue, your interview it has just disappeared. It never existed. And the morning show had a cassette tape that they would always run in the background of every interview, always record a backup recording, because in the event of a power outage or a catastrophic software or hardware computer failure, the cassette tape's backup recording wasn't going anywhere. Even if the power went out while it was recording,
it would just stop.
Yeah, it would just stop. There was no
Yeah.
digital file corruption possibility that could always, mini discs were notorious. I would lose such amazing things I had just recorded just because you didn't press stop before your battery died. The audio is gone.
Yeah.
In the midst of your
tragic
process. But with a cassette tape, the information that's stored there, it might be analog, but it's still weirdly more stable because it's analog.
Well, you are listening to Radio Survivor. We're here for the love of radio and sound. You just heard from Eric Klein and Jennifer Waits. I'm Paul Rees-Mandel. And we're talking about cassettes and analog media, the relationship to art and radio, and sort of, I think in some ways, marveling at the durability of this format that, sort of like radio, commentators have wanted to declare dead and buried, or at least tremendously passé time and time again over the last 25 years, and yet really refuses to die, not just in terms of simply being available, but in terms of people's desire to use it.
One of the things that you've just reminded me of as we're ending this conversation and transition to the next one is that I think another thing that Dogbotic was proselytizing in favor of during this cassette hacking workshop, which I think is very much a part of community radio culture as well, is this idea of being able to repair your equipment or understand the technology that you're making use of, and have more agency as a creator over the work, and allowing technology to get the better of us is sort of like the default that many companies sort of have built into their devices, to their software, to the products that we depend upon to be artists and creators and community members. But when you know how to solder, it sort of gives you a whole new
and the device is simple enough that it can be soldered, and you can, in a belt can be changed, and the parts can be exchanged.
I mean, I'm just thinking about all the times we've talked to people who've built community radio stations, especially stories about community radio stations in other countries that are thrown up and put on the air, in jungles and like that spirit of being able to get your hands on the technology and know how it works. I think you can't build a community radio station without people that know how to hack.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great point. And Jennifer, you noted how, air checks, people's, archiving their own radio shows on cassette. And I think it's arguable that, that if one is trying to find radio archives from the last 50 years, at the very least, there's more of them are probably on cassette because they were recorded either by listeners, amateurs in that way. I know that, say, Negative Land, in trying to reconstruct archives of Over the Edge, has relied on some very resolute listeners who have pretty extensive at-home recorded archives. Or, in the case of DJs and hosts themselves who recorded for their own posterity or review, because perhaps the station's archives would get recycled because the tape was too expensive.
Right. The hip hop radio archive that we did an interview on many moons ago, as well as the documentary about Slim and Bobito in New York City and their hip hop radio show. Like, the cassette archives were everything.
Well, and often it was really left to the DJ to archive their own show. I think, that was fairly common.
And probably still is in many cases. But Jennifer, that sort of made me think about, the value of especially though, listeners and audiences, and what this role they play in becoming archivists, whether they know it or not, or at least the input to archives. Because I know that you recently attended, I think it's a Society for Cinema and Media Studies conference, right? And had many papers and presentations and research about sound and radio and podcasting, but cassettes came up too.
They did. Yeah, I mean, every form of media came up, and it's interesting. There were so many papers, and it was all so fascinating to me as a popular culture fanatic. But I went to a panel, or I went to see a presentation, and the title of the paper was "Live Long and Prosper, Bootlegging Television in the 1970s and 1980s and the Social Life of Broadcast Recordings." And it was Nora Peterson. She was the scholar behind it. And so she mentioned something that I never heard before, that television fans shared cassette recordings of television shows. And there was this whole cottage industry.
And you're talking about audio cassette, not video cassette.
An audio cassette.
Yes.
And so you think, oh, well, fans, like maybe before you had a VCR where you could record a show, it never occurred to me that the way that you might preserve that show for your memory or as a fan to share with other people was by just recording the audio, because that was the tool that you had was, okay, I have a tape recorder, so I'll just record the show. And people would end up swapping these cassette tapes at fan conventions and through zines.
And so by mail, essentially, there would be like a directory, and they'd find each other, and someone, I'd mail you this cassette, and you'd mail me that cassette.
Exactly. So for things like Star Trek and Starsky and Hutch.
Oh, yeah.
And she talked about this, and this later includes video recordings as well. But so these audio cassettes people would record, or video cassettes later, she referred to that as an informal broadcast distribution. So there are, in addition to the official ways you might consume a television show, like over the airwaves, or perhaps the show is in reruns, so you get to watch it again. There are also these informal ways that that just regular consumers might share the broadcast with other people through their home taping. And
did she say how she was able to dig in? Did she get into her method at all, and how she was able to explore that landscape and learn about both, I guess, their existence and maybe more concrete things like about it? Was she working through things like looking at zines or other sorts of artifacts?
Yeah, absolutely. Looking at zines, talking to people who were fans. I think she's also immersed in the fan community. And she also historicized a little bit of this by mentioning, I wasn't aware of this, but she said that back in 1930, Victor actually marketed a home recording system to record off the radio onto transcription discs. And on the show, we've talked about transcription discs, which are records, essentially. We've talked about those being used in a radio station setting where you might be able to record a radio show onto vinyl that way. But I had never heard about something being marketed to everyday folks so that you could record onto a record in your own home off the radio.
I'm sure it was prohibitively expensive. I'm sure it was definitely something only the most dedicated of 1930s audio or radiophile could afford. But I sort of knew about this. So this is a deep-seated memory, but specifically around Star Trek fans, because they're so dedicated. And of course, now Star Trek is part of our popular culture, but went underground after it was canceled as a series, and it was a small and growing but fervent fan base that kind of kept the show alive in a lot of ways, and ultimately, convinced Hollywood it was worth reviving as movies and new series. But during the 80s, certainly, you could buy radios that had a TV band on them that allowed you to listen to the audio usually of just channels 3 through 13, right? Basically, the VHF band is known, in part because those frequencies are close to the FM band. So it doesn't require designing a significantly different sort of radio. When I was a child, in the time before I could have had my own television in the 80s, and certainly before we had a VCR, I desired a TV radio, a radio that has TV frequencies. And such a thing was significantly less expensive than buying, say, like would have been maybe 8 or 10 years old, a child my age, a television. And so eventually I did get one. And I'm certain I recorded I don't have any of these tapes any longer. I'm sorry.
So you listen to TV on your radio?
Yes.
I love that.
And made tapes.
And these were common. You could have walked into probably any Kmart, any Radio Shack, any store that sold radios probably sold them. I know currently I have a Sony radio in my house that is, its vintage is from the early 2000s. So it's pre-digital transition. It has AM, FM, and television.
Yeah,
my prize.
Right.
When I got a radio, and these were rare. A little later, probably as a tween, a radio that also picked up UHF television stations.
Oh yeah, we definitely had. I don't know if it picked up UHF, but we definitely had some radios in our house that picked up television, and I think my dad would listen on the radio while watching the television because it might have facilitated hearing the show a little bit better. So they could also be used in that manner.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Yeah. And certainly there were boom boxes. So radios with built-in cassette recorders that had type TV band as well. Not super common, but I know that they existed. So you had even, a facility, you didn't even have to, hook things up with wires, right? Or put a microphone in front of the radio, which is probably what I did when I was like 8 years old, in order to record this. So this is fascinating, And so Jennifer.
Before you ask a question, I just want to point out one more thing, that an interesting thing about these tapes is that people were also preserving a show perhaps the way it was intended to be broadcast the first time around. Because in this paper discussion, in this presentation, there was also discussion about how when shows were later rerun, sometimes things were cut out of them. So if you were a fan who recorded a show
Right.
in the beginning, then you were preserving the show the way it originally aired. And there might be scenes that people fondly remember that get cut out. And I hadn't really...
And they get cut out sometimes just for time.
Yeah,
exactly.
Often shows in syndication
Put more
are
commercials
shorter.
on.
But also sometimes they're cut out for content.
Yeah.
Right.
Because something was controversial or someone objected to it or any number of other reasons.
Yeah.
You know, and that's fascinating. And, you know, I know, you know, we talk to a lot of scholars, you know, some of whom are faculty, some people are independent researchers here about their research into radio and sound on Radio Survivor. And, you know, it seems like at this conference you went to for the Society of Cinema and Media Studies, there's quite a bit about radio, quite a bit about podcasting. And as we talked with Michelle Hilms a few weeks ago, a professor who is one of the leading scholars really in radio studies, you know, it seemed as though these subjects fell out of favor for quite some time in the academy, and there's rejuvenated interest in it. But I'm kind of curious why you think that's important. Like, why should, you know, somebody who is, you know, deeply interested in sound and radio, you know, maybe as a listener or who loves community radio, loves as a college radio station that's dear to them, why should they feel like it's a good thing to be buoyed by the fact that scholars are paying attention, and it seems like increasingly paying attention?
Oh, I mean, well, it's a validation of audio and sound in the first place. And I mean, for me as a fan of radio and audio, it enhances my enjoyment of radio and audio when I learn more of the context and more of the history and the ways that the history of radio parallels things that we see going on with podcasting today. So it kind of, you know, ends up helping to weave together all these threads to create a broader story. And in some cases, there might be papers about radio in different cultures. So I can then see connections between radio in the United States and radio in South Korea, for example. Michelle Hilms, when she was on the show, talked about drawing these connections because she was studying television and realized she really needed to go back to radio because that is where the foundations of some of these television genres came from, was radio. So, and I think with young people starting to become more interested in podcasting, it's probably interesting to learn, oh, wow, a lot of what I'm hearing in podcasts was something that comes from the early days of radio and things like radio drama. So that's, for me, I'm always learning whenever I go to an academic conference, and it helps me to see things about radio in a new way. You know, like I mentioned about recording TV off the radio, which I hadn't really thought about before, even though there might have been examples of it throughout my life, even in my own history. I hadn't really put it all together until I saw that paper. So that's what I really appreciate about scholars, is that sometimes they're just putting a whole new light on things that really opens up your ways of understanding something.
Certainly. And there's an old cliche that, you know, history repeats itself. And it's a bit too simplistic, I think, for us to rely on as some kind of principle. However, in many ways, threads and dynamics do tend to repeat, often because circumstances are not as dissimilar as you think they are.
Yeah,
you know?
like if you wanted to form a really educated and strongly factually based opinion about the podcasting work of Joe Rogan, you could do a lot worse than understanding, you know, voices that were on the radio in the 1930s or 40s and
or 70s for that matter.
And seeing the parallels and you know, and being able to sort of, you know, game out where this story is heading based on radio history.
And economically speaking, you know, I mean, podcasting is going through a period of consolidation right now, right? Beginning, you know, only about 2 years ago, right? With Spotify buying up networks and becoming the exclusive distributor of Joe Rogan's program. And now iHeart has bought up podcast networks and technology, right? This isn't in one way so different, perhaps, than what happened in the 1990s in radio, in consolidation of even other media industries, including film. And there may be lessons in that also for folks who may be concerned and not want a new medium like podcasting to look like radio did in 2010. Maybe there's also lessons to learn on what are our places to intervene, what can be done differently, what are the critical differences between podcasting and radio broadcasting, and how maybe amplifying what is different and relying on what is different and strengthening that difference
as well
might result in different outcomes.
The history of government intervention and regulation, both as regards to regulating speech on as well as the, who can own what in the industry. It's all right. It's, it all happened 100 years ago, give or take a few decades.
So Jennifer, attending this conference, which was virtual this year, as most conferences have been for the Society for Cinema and Media Studies, all this energy around sound and radio and podcasting. Does this give you the sense that, there's more to come? Does you get the sense that a lot of that there's new scholars, that these are, in the same way that we have Zoomers interested in hacking cassettes and making music, are we seeing folks that are just starting their academic careers now? So folks, essentially in their early to mid 20s, interested now in further delving into sound, radio, and podcasting.
Oh yeah, definitely. A lot of the scholars were young scholars who were represented at the conference, and there seems to be great interest in studying sound in a contemporary context, but also looking back at sound historically. So that is very exciting, very good news for sound studies and radio studies and podcast studies. And hopefully we'll have some of these folks on the show in the future. I was definitely taking notes furiously, and there are things we didn't get to talk about today that I'm excited to talk about further with some of the scholars who are doing this amazing work.
Yeah, it's been great. And what I've certainly noticed about the folks we've had on the show so far, many folks, is, I think it certainly, they're able to talk both as fans, and folks who are into sound and radio, as well as scholars, right? And that seems to be a true thread, that there's intrinsic interest and love underneath all of this, in addition, which drives, in many cases, their desire to learn more. And sometimes it's accidental that they stumble into it, and then want to learn more. And in some cases, they're fulfilling something which maybe has been with them for a very long time. But that's always the fun part.
Exactly. And among my radio scholar nerd friends, a lot of us did college radio. So there's definitely, some of these folks are used to communicating in that way too. And so they have that love for doing radio in addition to studying radio, which to me is a killer combination.
So I've got a couple things, but so I'm remembering recording Saturday morning cartoons off the television with my cassette recorder. The memory of why I remember this one of all things.
Was this with the TV recorder?
This was likely with the microphone hung in front of the speaker on the TV.
Yeah.
Because it probably was maybe a little before I had more advanced wiring skills. But I remember sort of recording the Chipmunks. There was a Chipmunks like Saturday morning show, so like an 80s revival, rather than like the classic 60s. And then playing it over my AM radio transmitter.
What? How old were you?
10-ish.
Yeah.
So you had an AM radio transmitter when you were 10?
So there were these, you could buy at Radio Shack. It was called like 101 Electronics Kit. So it's this big kind of lucite breadboard that had electronic components, and each one had like 2 springs. And then you got a big book of projects that you could build. So you could build like an alkalinity tester. You could build, and it had like a little piezo speaker. It came with a microphone. So you could build a radio, like something that's more like a crystal radio, but not quite. And one of the projects was to build an AM transmitter. And of course, that was the first thing I built, right? And, and they give you, and you have all these wires, and they're all tin, and you can just kind of connect up the parts according to the diagram. And then it had a little crystal microphone. And it may be actually that the microphone was the earphone, like because you can do that. So maybe that was it. And
which is something they taught us in the Dogbotic cassette hacking workshop. We took apart the speaker on one of the Walkmans and turned it into a microphone.
Paul, what was the name of this kit again?
It was called like a Radio Shack, like 100 electronics projects in one. And they were sold throughout the 60s into the 90s.
Yeah.
And mine came from a garage sale. And as I recall, probably unused, probably some kid who's like, I don't want this garbage. And I'm the kid who's like, yeah, forget the baseball mitt, give me the 101 electronics kit. Yeah, they were very common. And one of the projects was building an AM transmitter. So which I did, in which, then there was like the longest piece of wire might have been, 2 feet long. And then there's a stern warning not to put a longer wire.
Nah.
So of course, what is the first thing I do?
Because then you're transmitting beyond the legal limit. Is that why?
I mean, potentially. I doubt the power output was significant enough. But yes, that would have been probably
that's great.
The concern that it would only be guaranteed to be compliant with Part 15.
So you're
with a certain and there is an actual antenna size limit in the rules.
So you've got
it's longer than that.
You've got your cassette deck with a recording of a Saturday morning cartoon 80s TV show running
Chipmunks
running through your AM transmitter. And so, are you leaving it in the room and going down into the?
Yes, of course. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. The next thing is you walk out the door with the radio to see how many
far?
blocks away you could hear your Chipmunks broadcast. Absolutely, yes.
And did you make people listen to it? Did you tell your parents like turn on your radio?
I might have. I probably mostly I harangued my little brother, who was really too young to appreciate it at the time. But he may have memories of this. So that is sort of I never thought about all those things coming together, and I've always sort of taken for granted that people, or at least I, recorded things off the television on the cassette. But I mean, I don't know that I don't have any. I don't think I do. Maybe there's some unmarked box in my parents' attic of my things that maybe might have a cassette like that. But it makes you think, yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if, I was a huge television, I still am. I love television. And I got a tape recorder when I was in kindergarten, and I definitely remember taping things off the radio and interviewing family members, but I don't know if I taped television. That's very intriguing to me.
Yeah, I don't think I ever did either. Same deal. Although I was, it wasn't very long before I would have had a VCR. To record TV. So I would have only had a weird early chunk of my childhood with a tape recorder and not a VCR. But I heard I heard this the first time I heard about taping, using an audio tape to record the television, was on a really wonderful Spotify owned podcast from Gimlet Media. This was prior to Spotify owning my appreciation of the podcast Heavyweight. No, it was Mystery Show. Mystery Show that I've never stopped talking about. And the last episode of Mystery Show was the story was about the host of the podcast Heavyweight, who's also a famous radio producer from the This American Life days of the early 2000s, Jonathan Goldstein, I believe. And Jonathan Goldstein presents a mystery for Mystery Show based on a Welcome Back Kotter. It's a Welcome Back Kotter based mystery, but we learn that Jonathan Goldstein recorded a large amount of Welcome Back Kotter episodes onto audio cassette to re-listen to them. And in fact, there's like kind of a suggestion in my mind as a listener that this was sort of his journey as a writer, was, you know, analyzing the scripts and storytelling as well as the vocal delivery of the written lines on this on this extremely New York voiced youth culture television program, like having that audio tape to replay and to take notes from seemed like a important part of his development as an artist.
Well, it's amazing because I think it's hard for, well, I mean, there still are a lot of things we don't have access to as far as television archives. But I think a lot of people, I'll say, assume that we can find everything online. We can find things on YouTube.
Depends
but
on
there are
what
a lot
you
of things you still can't find. And so that makes sense to, if you're recording your show on your audio cassette, then you can reference it again. This is before the days of streaming and being able to rent things, but there's some things that you still can't access at all.
The 5-year-old example from Radio Survivor that we've talked about before is when music licensing has developed a cost prohibitive. The archive of the television program can no longer contain the original licensed music because of how much it would cost. So WKRP in Cincinnati was one example from the 80s television program about a radio station in which the songs being played in the scene were hit songs of the day and integral to the storylines. And then when they released it on DVD, you can't have those songs anymore because those become the most expensive things.
It drives me crazy.
In the catalog.
We talked about that on an episode, and I might have referenced that The Real World, there are scenes on The Real World where I remember the music being integral to the scene.
Yeah.
And there was just a Real World reunion reboot show that was incredible. It was really well done, where they brought back cast members from the original
50-year-old cast members, yeah.
Yeah, the original season in New York. And there was a scene that I appreciated so much because they replayed a scene from the original series for the cast members on the TV or the video display in their loft. And it was a scene that, I don't know, that perhaps we had seen. I had just rewatched the first season too. And the scene that they played it with the original music. And I was like, aha, I was right. I know I was right, because embedded within the episode, they actually played it with the correct music, right, even though the episode that they show, as
the rerun.
The rerun still has this sort of generic music that they inserted in its place.
Because in the 90s, anything that aired on MTV, they already had a built-in license for any hit song that they could edit it into their show without having to pay
in perpetuity,
without having to pay extra.
Like Beavis and Butthead, because half the show was Beavis and Butthead watching music videos and making fun of them, right?
As well as
that's half the show.
The biggest example in my life as a fan is the sketch comedy program The State, with this 90s television program every sketch, well, not every sketch, because I actually found the VHS tape and went through my VHS tape of an episode of The State, but every episode they would utilize the pop music of the time, and it would become a meta commentary on the jokes that they were telling. So, a song like Two Princes by
Spin Doctors,
when that song plays in a sketch, it means something. It has a feeling that it's evoking of, it's already its own joke. And so when you layer that on top of the other joke, that's part of what was going on in the 90s, making fun of this Spin Doctors song in the context of this other joke that they're telling on the sketch comedy show. And then now, it took like 7, 8, 10 years for The State to be released on DVD because they needed to mount the expensive production effort of replacing all the music. Every hit song had to be stripped away from they had to re-edit the entire series. It's kind of a remarkable second.
Because even then, at a time when home video exists, they hadn't really thought of,
right.
well, gee, maybe several years down the line, somebody would want to own this.
Right, and they were in their early 20s when they were making it, right? So these
and it wouldn't have been up to them anyway, probably, right? It probably would have been up to executives.
I hope nobody gets rid of their home taped. I mean, when I was in grad school studying television, I relied on friends who shared things they had taped off the television for me so that I could write papers about certain TV shows that I couldn't, find the videotapes for elsewhere. And I mean, it's really heroic in a way if you think about the folks who have saved these and what will become of these taped off the television archives. I know the Internet Archive has accepted an influx of these amazing home recordings that this woman in Philadelphia.
But I'm curious now if they have any that are on audio tape.
Oh, funny.
Oh, yeah, we'll have to.
I'll have to take a look. But thinking of the audio side, though, I mean, it makes you think of Don Joyce, right? The sensible host of Over the Edge, because that was his method. Right, of gaining so much of the audio assets that he would use were taped onto cassettes. I mean, and when you think about it, it's efficient. And if all you want is the audio, why take the video, right? Because it's simply a bulkier cassette. It's less reliable, harder to probably to manipulate and deal with, even in terms if you're digitizing it. And probably it'll turn out in 10 or 15 years, there will be audio cassettes that are still playable while videotapes are not, because they're simply more complex and more subject to failure compared to audio cassettes, which are just really simple in terms of their mechanical complexity. But and that was his source, right? And his method of he would record cassettes for hours and hours. He sort of had them always recording, as you see in the documentary, how radio isn't done, and then edit them, but really essentially just dub them from one cassette to another to get the parts, and then using that often to feed into another tape recorder, a cart recorder,
which can play backwards. I've never wanted a cart machine so badly.
Not all of them do.
Right, but Don Joyce would. Actually, now I'm not sure if I remember if Don Joyce would reverse his tapes, but he would certainly had he could manipulate the speed of his cart machines. Live on the air in a way that made me think
and
about
sometimes
during
that wasn't
the cassette hacking workshop.
And sometimes that wasn't really a feature so much; it was a maintenance feature, meaning it might be a dial on the back, which is just meant to tune it to make sure it's staying in pitch. But then, but I definitely remember
if he could run it backwards. So I'm sorry, but you could probably take the tape out.
Yeah, well, you could. Machine. Yeah, they're a pain to work with compared to cassettes. But an intrepid person could do it. But certainly the cassette decks that we used in community radio, and I remember in college radio, all had a pitch function. These were like the Tascam, industrial, rack-mounted steel cassette decks, and they all
we've got pitch on all the CD players too. So there's some people that manipulate their pitch on every device at the station.
The fun part about the cassette hacking workshop that I didn't really get into, because it's really the best part, was we learned about integrated chips, which are a whole new set of complexity. And so we actually built a few different machines and then had to take them apart and build new machines with the same parts, that you could manipulate the motor speed in we actually built a simple sequencer so that you could manipulate the speed rhythmically. Every few seconds it would change to a different speed and then would change back in a rhythm that was predictable. And so it's a very mind-blowing collision of analog and digital potential for sound creation. Again, yes, you could go into your mouse with your DAW and decide, I'm going to take this 1 second clip and make it this speed, and this 1 second clip and make it this speed, and then I'm going to have that change over time. But to have all of that available to you with the spinning of a tiny potentiometer or two potentiometers at once, changing over time. It's just there's a hands-on analog dirty punk rock. It's like making your zine on your computer or making your zine by Xeroxing.
Yeah.
By Xeroxing with
or collage
with scissors
cutting
and
out magazines
with scissors and
Photoshop.
glue sticks. Like, yes,
I love it.
Yeah.
Are they doing more of these workshops? Because now I want to take it.
Oh, they are, and I highly recommend it. I had a wonderful time.
I have one more thing, because we're talking around the obsolescence here, right? And how, as you mentioned earlier, Eric, the iPad or the computer can be great for doing all your sound manipulations until it will no longer run the OS you need to run that software, or it doesn't update you didn't expect it to, and now nothing works.
One of my favorite new YouTube musician, gearhead YouTube review channels calls it Apple's bullpucky, but not bullpucky. He uses and it's just that, like, he talked about how Apple technology tends to be planned obsolescence on a speed, on a time frame that is impossible to keep up with as a professional, unless you spend top dollar in a way that's not necessary. Like the thing that he plugs into his iPod from 2 years ago doesn't work anymore, but it could. They broke it.
Yeah. Well, on April 30, thousands of internet radios broke.
Oh, that's right.
Because they were all using a directory service called Receiva, which ultimately got bought by Qualcomm, which formerly made cell phones and made lots of other things, or a chip maker. And so these radios, like a Grace Digital radio or a C. Crane internet radio, lost the ability to search and find radio stations.
These were fun devices that were like a bridge between having a radio in your home, and having a laptop that you would turn on, plug into the speakers, and tune in to all of the web radio stations. You could have this box that would find web radio stations all around the world.
They still exist.
Yeah, and that's been essentially my clock radio has been an internet radio.
Yeah.
And we've had trouble connecting to Wi-Fi, so mine has not really been working for a while, so I'm not exactly sure. I'll have to plug it in and attempt it again.
Break it.
But yeah, it feels like something that has increasingly not been working, even though it was sort of a dream for me to be able to tune into radio stations that I can't actually get normally over the airwaves in my house, and I could just turn the dial like I would on a radio from my childhood. I love it.
I know, and it may be because a lot of the stations weren't getting updated. Because here's the thing:
broken links.
The thing about radio, broadcast terrestrial radio, is that they're all in a known place, and even with shortwave, it can get complex, and there's a lot to go on.
The technology to tune in the radio station in the 30s, you can. Yeah, they didn't. There's not going to be a broken link. To a radio station.
There's only so many spots on the dial. So even if a station changes its position on the dial, if you scan around, you can find it.
So wait, who do we blame about these broken internet radios?
Qualcomm. But because internet radio stations, it's not like there's some master. There is no master directory. Ostensibly, this was it. But any given college, community, public, commercial radio station could say tomorrow, "Oh, geez, we." The service we were using quit functioning, and we're going to a new service for our internet stream. And on their website, they update it. It's got a new address, got a new URL.
Yeah.
Maybe they're able to get it into a change in a directory. podcasting suffers from the same problem of Apple right now, apparently, has not been updating its podcast directory as well. And lots of podcasts have gone missing as they've updated it. And it's often functioned as a de facto master directory of podcasts, but isn't. You don't have to list a podcast in Apple, and Apple rejects some podcasts from their directory for a number of reasons.
You can have an RSS feed that functions perfectly well that Apple
doesn't know about.
Will not include.
But of course, it means a lot of people won't easily find your station. And there is actually a open source podcast directory project happening now, which I think is a very good thing. There are open source radio directories, but in many cases, two of the largest companies, iHeart and Entercom, now known as Odyssey, don't want their stations listed. They only want them listed either in their proprietary apps. Sure. And so sometimes the listings in something like is much more kind of opt-in. And maybe the one most people are familiar with as a brand name is TuneIn.
Yeah.
TuneIn Radio. And often TuneIn is available as like an app on, not just smartphones, but also on things like Roku's, connected televisions. So if you have a Sonos,
I don't even know
one way that you would listen to radio is via the TuneIn app.
Other than TuneIn, I don't know of any other way to do it on my Apple smartphone.
Oh no, there's lots of third-party apps that use different directories. Just search around.
I should download a new one.
I can't refer it to you because I don't remember off the top of my head, but they exist, and I've written about it. So you can go to radiosurvivor.com because especially with Apple, Apple dropped internet radio for a while in its update of its music apps.
Funny.
So it only had like a smattering of stations, whereas Apple for a very long time, iTunes had a very large, extensive,
right,
and interesting directory of internet radio stations you could explore. Another one you could look at is VLC. So Video LAN, I forget what C stands for, but VLC is a very long-standing open source audio and video player project. I'm pretty sure there are apps for both Android and iPhone. There's certainly apps for
as well as
Macs, Windows, and Linux.
Exactly.
And there's also an internet radio directory there that you can kind of fool around with. But again, it's not embedded in your Grace Digital internet radio.
And do you know why they removed this directory?
Why did they
break Qualcomm? They just didn't want to fund it anymore. I mean, I think it was probably, as far as I can understand, it was really just sort of, not very useful.
There's probably a very good internet history podcast in the making about why they were the default catalog of internet radio stations in the first place.
It was once an independent company that then was acquired, right? And I understand that both Grace Digital and C. Crane in particular, as being two of the bigger manufacturers, like offering discounts on new radios that are more future proofed. I think a lot of them, I know a little less if I haven't owned one. They say often if you have presets, those will still work as long as the station is still at the old address, because it sort of stores that address in its memory. And that many of them, you can go in and like manually enter information for a station, but that's sort of a clunky process, especially when you don't have a keyboard and you're using whatever dials and stuff you have to input it. And it certainly doesn't make it the kind of scanning discovery experience that you would have otherwise.
It's very different than surfing the internet to move the little dial through every letter of the alphabet to try to find things.
Yeah, I had a AV receiver, a Yamaha, that and this is a lot of AV receivers. There's a lot of hidden features that people don't always realize that they have, like a home theater receiver. Most of them do HD radio, for instance. It's one of the few ways that it's easy to get HD radio in your house. But mine also had an internet radio service. I don't have it any longer, and I don't know whether it was receive or who it was. And it wasn't quite a scanning kind of experience. I don't know what the interface was like on your Grace Digital, but it definitely, it would usually either you had like a genre list or, a format list or a country list, and depending on the country, sometimes, like in the United States, it got fairly fine grained to state and sometimes city. Whereas sometimes it was just like New Zealand, or just like, it's a tiny country. It's all New Zealand. And I would have fun going through there, and you kind of, you'd see the interface on your television. So you sort of had a way to go through it. You could kind of see it on the screen on the receiver, but it was a little tough to read. And I used to have fun with that a little bit, kind of scanning around and finding new stations. I don't know what it was like the experience on your
I wonder
Grace
if that
digital radio.
there was, it was funny because it's not the first time it came up into my feeds, but it was about 3 or 4 weeks ago. The global map of internet radio stations went mildly viral again.
yeah.
Garden.
I had a group.
No,
yes,
Yep.
Garden.
I had a group of friends share it.
Yeah,
at
likewise.
random. And it was nice. And I wonder how that map is doing. Radio Garden, yeah. Very cool.
Yeah.
Very cool way to surf the internet,
It is,
as
yeah.
the kids say.
Look around the globe and listen to radio stations. And I wrote about it on Radio Survivor back when it went around the first time.
Yeah.
The first time we spun the globe.
Well, isn't it nice to know that something like Radio Garden has more than one opportunity to go viral? We often, I think, assume that virality is associated or intrinsic to novelty or newness, but that something like Radio Garden might be novel to somebody who's never seen it before, and if they happen to have the right social media network, can sort of resurface it.
It is, I know, it is exciting. I feel like it's gone viral at least 3 or 4 times, actually. It might have been on Boing Boing at one point, and then that seems to make it viral among a certain subset of people. It's fascinating.
It would not have broke because of these this Qualcomm. Would it? Would that be possible?
Radio Garden? No, my understanding is Radio Garden has its own database. Yeah,
it's hand curated. So
yeah, I think you can submit. Yeah, and have a station on there.
Okay.
Right, and then it began with stations that they hand selected. I know this because KFJC was on there and I was excited about it. And then they were excited that somebody from KFJC was talking to them, which made me excited.
I'm going to listen to Radio Garden as soon as we go.
I know.
Right.
The air.
Oh, yeah. I spent like a whole Saturday back when it had the second. Oh, no. I spent a whole Saturday on World Radio Day. That's what I was doing.
Right. But just going up and down the coast of Africa. Like what could be better?
And yeah.
Well, it's great to have that visual mapping, and we actually talked about this at a recent Radio Preservation Task Force meeting. People were interested in mapping, and I also mentioned the Brooklyn Pirate Radio map. Like, there's something about listening to radio from a map, which is kind of cool and makes it maybe it brings people into radio in a different way when it's on this coolly designed visual map.
Well, it reminds us that it is truly geographic. Like, radio exists in geographic space. And so while internet radio is sort of removed from that, a large percentage of these stations represented in Radio Garden are terrestrial stations, and so really do have a terrestrial footprint. And then even if we take apart the literal terrestrial footprint of the radio waves and how far they can go, there's also, the community that likely fuels and supports that station, even if it's entirely online, right? The local internet community radio stations or college internet stations, etc., are likely still fueled by, in many ways, and mostly listened to by people who are in a particular locality, and you might not otherwise really have heard of them unless you were in that locality. So it gives you that kind of way in. But I'm reminded of Radio Free America, unfortunately, which has gone away, which was a community and college radio directory online. Again, itself completely, separate from any of these, so not tied to any other service. And perform 2 functions. One, of course, being a directory, so you could listen in to college and community stations around the country. But then they also provided an archiving service, which I think ultimately was what was not sustainable, where you could listen to something like 2 weeks worth of an archive of pretty much any of these stations. And so you had the ability not just to travel over geography, but to travel over time.
Well, and along those, a similar thing was the college radio map, which later became SoundTap, which I think you can still access it, but it's a way of accessing college and community radio streams. And it was originally a map, like a map of the United States, where you could pick a point on the map to listen to a college radio station. So it was kind of like a place like TuneIn, where it was just connecting to the existing stream of a radio station rather than being an archive like Radio Free America was.
Right. And so possibly more sustainable. And at least the thing with like a web app is that ostensibly it goes obsolete much more slowly than a computer app. Although eventually, if you try to look at Radio Garden with Windows 98, you're probably going to have some problems. It's probably not going to work so well. But provided that the person who, of course, is put together the website is willing to continue to fund it and keep it online, which is the critical part, then your machine's capabilities are a little less critical, I suspect. I don't want to go on record and say this is a principle. But, ultimately that's, if the folks who fund Radio Garden run out of funding or are no longer able to do it, right, that's
right.
Poof. It's, so
I'm going to start making an archive of my Radio Garden streaming.
I mean, that's why there's the Internet Archive. I mean, which, something like an app is hard to archive, I suspect.
Right,
not
but
as
if
easy
you
as
could,
a website.
You can make a tape of one day's worth of Radio Garden listening to go back.
We need our we need our software defined radios now. We need that to be part of the whole conversation. Have the software defined radios set up to record a day of Radio Garden.
I don't think that works.
Somebody could build
Unfortunately.
it. Someone can hack it together somehow.
I don't think that quite works. Someone could definitely write software that could do the equivalent. But you just
I guess that's true. It's not
buy a lot of hard drives.
Radio Garden is not over shortwave or over FM.
Yeah, just buy a lot of hard drives, I think is what we're talking about. That's what we'll leave you with, friends. Buy a lot of hard drives.
You have to run. Thank you for listening to Radio Survivor. On behalf of Jennifer Waits and Paul Reese-Mendel, my name is Eric Klein. If you'd like to email us here at Radio Survivor, the email address is podcast@radiosurvivor.com. We would love to hear from you, your questions, your comments, your reactions, your stories, your show ideas. Show notes as well as audio archives are online at radiosurvivor.com. Radio Survivor is a listener and reader-supported enterprise. To find out more, you can go to radiosurvivor.com/support. You can also subscribe to our show wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you so much for listening. We'll see you next week.